Good evening, Berean. It's good to be with you on this, our Lord's Day. We do greet you in the name of the Lord. We welcome those of you who are online with us, and we thank you for being a part of our Bible study this evening. This morning's sermon focused on, really introduced Acts chapter 10. We did not get into the actual text of this great chapter, but my goal was to introduce to you the framework for a clear understanding of the significance of this text and the implications of it for the plan of God, the universal plan of God, the eternal plan of God, if you will, for the salvation of the human soul. And so where else would we begin but in the book of Genesis? After a brief introduction this morning, I turned to this book in order for us to gain some insight into the foundation of Gentile salvation. Where does Gentile salvation begin? And it begins in, of course, the book of Genesis and God's provision for salvation. In order to save man, God had to discipline Adam and Eve and remove them from the garden in order to allow for the conversion of the human soul. And so that's where we started. We started in Genesis with the fall. We looked at the implications of the fall, which was humanity's deep spiritual inability. They were dead. We were dead in our trespasses and sins. And so God made salvation possible by removing Adam and Eve from the context of the tree of life, so they couldn't eat it. And then after tracing the inability of mankind from Genesis 4 through Genesis chapter 11, we then saw that God chose a man, an individual, Abraham, and he chose to work through him. Now, God's selection of Abraham didn't just have implications for Abraham, it also had implications for Gentiles, those peoples of the earth, those families of the world, the families of the earth that God spoke of in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. And so I talked a little bit about that critical text and that God was intending to bless not just the line of Abraham directly, but also every family on the face of the earth. After looking at the foundation of Gentile salvation, we then looked at the extent of it. Obviously, in the Old Testament, we have a few Gentiles who attach themselves to the people of God, the more well-known, of course, being Rahab and Ruth are two of the more well-known candidates, but there are a number of other candidates in the Old Testament that attach themselves to the Jewish people, but for the most part, we don't see a lot of Gentiles being converted. So I began to look at the extent of God's intention. What was the extent of his intent? And by looking at the prophets, we get an idea of just the extent that God had in mind for bringing Gentiles into his family. We looked at Isaiah chapter 2, Zechariah chapter 8. These are two critical texts that clearly indicate there would be a mass inclusion of Gentiles into the people of God. After the extent of Gentile salvation, we then looked at the framework. How is God going to accomplish this? How would God bring it to pass? And within the text that we looked at, we saw a key, a hint, if you will, to understanding the framework of Gentile inclusion. And the hint was a revival amongst the Jewish people. There would be a spiritual awakening among the Jews. We looked at this spiritual awakening from the context of Isaiah chapter 9. You see it all over the Old Testament. It's all over the prophets. But we see it particularly brilliantly in Isaiah chapter 9. Of course, this is the famous text with the baby being born. We all know that from Christmas, of course, verses 6 and 7 of Isaiah 9. But it's the beginning of Isaiah 9 that was really key for us. Because in the beginning of Isaiah 9, God is contrasting, he's coming out of Isaiah 8, which is gloom and judgment and devastation, And then God says at the beginning of Isaiah 9, no more gloom. The gloom is gone. What would remove the gloom? A light. A light of extraordinary proportions that would light up the people of Israel. But not just Israel. As we began to look at this revival, at first you don't see the link to the Gentiles. Of course, in Isaiah chapter 9, we see that Israel's revival is taking place in the context of the Gentiles, but you don't see the actual direct application to the Gentiles. And so I took us over to Luke chapter 2. And in Luke chapter 2, we have a prophetic statement made by Simeon as he embraces the Messiah. God had told him he would not die till he saw the Messiah. And so he goes into the temple. He meets Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus. He embraces the baby Jesus, and he makes a prophetic statement that is an application of Isaiah chapter 9 to Christ. And in his application of Isaiah chapter 9, we see a definite escalation in the critical interpretation of this text, where not only does the salvation take place amongst the peoples, the nations, but it also takes place in that there's a light to the Gentiles specifically. And so we see here that the promise of the Old Testament met in Jesus Christ. And then we looked at three critical texts in Jesus' life: Matthew chapter 8, Matthew chapter 28, and Acts chapter 1, verse 7 and 8, in which Jesus himself expresses the Gentile inclusion. And it would be a major part of what he would be doing, what the church would be doing. The churches would be focused on the Gentile inclusion. And so we saw there the framework of Gentile salvation. And then finally, we know this is an important text. Why? Because who's involved? The orchestrator of this, the Apostle Peter. We looked at Peter throughout the book of Acts, going through Acts chapter 1, Acts chapter 2, Acts 3, 4, 5, 8. These are all critical texts. Peter's involved in every critical instance within the early church. But then we noticed something here. We noticed that Cornelius lived in Caesarea, and there was already a missionary in Caesarea. Philip was living there. In fact, Philip may very well have been from Caesarea and just returned home in lieu of the persecutions. Anyway, he's established in Caesarea, but God bypasses Philip. Not because Philip can't be trusted with the gospel. Clearly he could. He took the gospel to the Samaritans. But the significance of Acts chapter 10 is it stands in a set of texts, Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 8, and Acts chapter 10, which is the inclusion of every single ethnic group in the church. Acts chapter 2, the Jews; Acts chapter 8, the Samaritans; and then Acts chapter 10, every other ethnic group, all under the heading of Gentile. And so Peter's role here is essential, it's critical, as he comes in and brings the gospel to the Gentile people. Next week, in my introduction, I'll be looking a little bit at Peter's own framing of this. I mean, Peter understood the significance of this. Peter understood that he was opening the gate, opening the door, if you will, to the Gentile population. Any questions on the morning's message? Yes.
So Peter had a prominent place amongst your apostles. Clearly, Jesus gave him that special privilege to say, like you said, he's opening the gates, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
There's in the Catholic doctrine, obviously, there's a papacy and the continuity of and he was considered the first pope, although there's no evidence of that
Yes.
in Christian historical documents and that sort of thing. So how do you defend against that in terms of if a Catholic brings up, look, Peter is given prominence, he's given, where would you go? How would you address that?
Yeah, I would. So the papacy's assuming of Peter as the basis for papal authority, I would answer that in several ways. First off, I would demonstrate that the significance of Peter fades and the significance of Paul increases. And so, as you look at what's going on in the Book of Acts, if you're going to appeal to the Book of Acts, you have to appeal to the whole Book of Acts. And it's pretty clear there that Paul becomes the focal point of Acts from Acts chapter 13 on. That's number one. Number two, Peter, really all the apostles, didn't have the authority to pass on their apostolic authority to anybody else. That's why you have no other apostles. And so clearly Peter's authority, as all the apostles' authority, was limited. The next thing that I would do is I see your hand. I'll call you in just a moment. The next thing I would do is I would demonstrate that papal authority historically did not really come into play until probably the 400s to 500s AD. And so it's not like the early church recognized Roman authority and Peter's authority based in Rome. Okay, so history tells us that the church didn't adopt that viewpoint. So you have Scripture, you have the apostles' inability to pass on their authority, and then you have history. Then you have the transformation in the Book of Acts from Peter to Paul. The fourth thing I would say is Peter clearly in 2 Peter chapter 3 recognizes Paul's authority, and Peter himself says, look, I have a hard time understanding Paul. And so clearly Peter had an understanding of the significance of Paul, the significance of Paul's writings, even in his own life. So that's the kind of the pathway I would try to take them to the Book of Acts itself, theologically and then historically. Go ahead. Yes.
Taking that same idea, so one, in terms of all the apostles, he was elevated. You can see even Bruce points out in his book that Peter's rise falls off, and James in Jerusalem at least he increases, whereas Paul takes a more Gentile view. But there's an element of whether it's Peter or James having a leadership amongst the apostles picture. And when it comes to the New Testament governance and thinking about plurality of elders, today in modern New Testament churches, if you will, there's an element of a pastor and an elder difference. In the New Testament, you see more of a plurality of elders having equal authority.
Yes.
How do you, in churches where they defend, okay, there's a leader, a pastor who is above the other elders, how do you see that in church today? How do you see that in general?
So I would say that most of the time when you have in the modern church, when you have a group of elders, normally they recognize, in most sound churches, eldership is understood to be all those in authority are on par with each other. Now, where you get into problems is where you have pastor and deacons as a board, or pastor, deacons, and trustees as a board, where you have one ecclesiological person, the pastor, quote unquote, and then the others are kind of subservient to him. And so that's the way our church was when I first came here. We became elder ruled, and as we understand, and even that does not tell you where the church is, because I know many elder ruled churches where they have a separation between teaching elders and ruling elders. Well, we don't do that here, obviously. as we understand the New Testament, if you're an elder, you have to have the gift of teaching, or you can't be an elder. And so all of our elders teach in some way, because that's a part of the office. It's not something you can pick and choose. And so I would say that even when there are elders in place and they recognize they all have the same authority, sometimes they don't run it biblically. And I would also say that, because you asked about historically, I think we're in somewhat of a renaissance in the last 50 to 100 years on eldership. I think eldership has become more normative in America, because it seemed like it was rare to run into an elder-ruled church 20, 30 years ago, but now they're very, very common. And so I think that eldership has kind of grown in significance and importance here in America, which is a good thing, because it's biblically normative ecclesiology. And so I would just encourage people who are listening, maybe who don't go to elder-ruled churches, hopefully their pastor is open to that prospect and should be encouraged to think along those lines. But it is biblically normative ecclesiology and should be pursued the way we have eldership here. I don't serve as the chairman of the board. That's Don Ellis. He has authority on the board when the board is in session. My role in the elder board is to represent the desires of the elders to the public. And so what I teach, I lead meetings and so on, that's really on behalf of the elders. And so I'm representing the elders to the congregation. But when it comes to the board and its functioning, when it's in session, that's Elder Ellis. He's the chairman of the board, and he runs the elders and make sure that they do what they're intended to do biblically. And then I come out of the elder meeting and run the church. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We'll go up here and then to Sister Pam. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think that it's interesting with Peter. He was married. Jesus healed his mother, Peter's mother-in-law, and the Roman Catholics take this, which I basically see as demonic doctrine of church leadership not being married at all, like abstaining totally, which is totally counter to the person that they say started their whole, I consider, cult.
Yeah, it's not the way Peter lived.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's totally counter to the one that they look to and claim. It makes no sense.
Yeah, Paul is pretty specific in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Peter carried with him, traveled with a wife, and that's pretty clear. You really can't deny that, and that is a good point against the Catholics' incorrect doctrine regarding Peter. Yes.
Kind of crazy question, but I think it's kind of related to what you said this morning. But because the Jews trace their history back to Abraham, he's the start of the Jews, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So before Abraham, weren't all those people Gentiles?
Yes, Abraham was a Gentile. Abraham was an idol-worshiping Gentile.
Right. So how do you think about salvation before Abraham, from Adam to Abraham?
We have cases, of course, of people being saved. That's pretty clear. As to how, we would say how they're saved after Abraham. They believed God, and he reckoned that to them as righteousness. It's not as explicitly clear until Abraham comes, but I wouldn't postulate another way to be saved other than that.
So would you say from Adam to Abraham, from the genealogy, would you have to say that every one of those down to him, there's somebody on that generation saved? Or you can't say that?
There's a lot of debate as to the nature of the genealogies, what they reveal, what they don't reveal. I would say that there are definitely people converted between Adam and Abraham. How many, I can't say. And the role of the genealogies in that conversion list, I can't say. I don't want to say that every person mentioned because obviously there's more people than the genealogies cover. So then you have to speculate, why were these people mentioned? Were they converted? And I don't feel comfortable saying that. But what I do believe that there was salvation taking place prior to Abraham. But God, in order to accomplish his plan to bring about the mass conversion of mankind, required the plan that he initiated with Abraham.
So I was fascinated that you didn't talk about the Table of Nations
Yes.
in salvation.
I normally would talk about the Table of Nations, but I did not. That's probably coming up within the next 3 or 4 messages.
Oh, okay.
But-
So you're going to hit that.
Maybe.
Well, I just thought it was, that is where the nations come from.
Correct.
And so if all the nations are going to be represented in salvation, you kind of have to have the nations before you have the salvation of the
Yeah,
nations.
yeah, absolutely. Normally, I would spend some time in the Table of Nations. You kind of heard me over the years, and so I would normally at least mention what happened there and how the church reverses that. It's a reversal of the tower and the consequences of the tower. But we still have time to mention it.
Okay. And one last question.
Okay.
I'm just always amazed is when you read prophecy, especially Isaiah, or where you were in Zechariah too. It's just always amazing to me what you see that pertains to today, or what God is doing.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right, Pam. I read. My Bible reading takes me through the Bible about once every 2.5 years, and I'm just kind of amazed at the way stuff just pops out that I've never seen before, or never understood before, or that's in there. I mean, it's just. I mean, and the specificity with some of the prophets is just astounding. I mean, and I mean, we saw it this morning. It's really amazing. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have 2 questions. One is online, and one is from me. I'll start with the one online. The online question is not directly related to the topic you're discussing, but I figure I'll just ask anyway. It says, should you learn how to love yourself in order to love God, or learn how to love God in order to love yourself?
So this is an interesting question. It's a fascinating question, and I would say that the natural human psyche leans towards loving of self. That's what we do normally. I don't believe a person needs to learn to love themselves. I think that's what they do, and it's the inherent narcissism in all of us, myself included. All of us have it, that tends to exasperate our sin nature. We are self-focused as people. And this is why the Bible has to regularly call us out from ourselves. And oftentimes, Leviticus 19, verse 18 is used as the basis of the idea of loving oneself, when in fact, it doesn't say that we're to love ourselves. It says that we do already love ourselves, love our neighbor as we love ourselves. As is not exhorting us to do it, it's saying use the same love you have for yourself for other people. And so I would say that the greatest thing we can work on, that we can pursue, is loving God. That takes us outside of ourselves and our natural narcissistic tendencies.
Okay.
All right.
I guess that would fit in the category of, there are some people who have quote unquote problem with self-love. Like that's not the default or normal. There's something, I would say probably there's something off psychological with someone who hates themselves basically. That's not a norm.
Yeah, I would have to talk to that individual, but even those who hate themselves, it's really an over focus on self. That's causing that. I mean, all of this goes back to to the basic sinful tendencies of ourselves. Some of us keep it in check better than others of us, but all of us have it in spades.
Okay. My next question is, you just mentioned something about at some point you started to see Peter kind of diminish in one sense and Paul's ministry kind of rise to the surface more. And I just thought about this, given that the majority of the New Testament was written by Paul, who was apostle to the Gentiles. I wonder if the reason why there seem to be more, Paul ministry has more of the New Testament, was written more of the New Testament than any of the other apostles, not to diminish any of them or even the Jewish nation, was that salvation came to the Jews first, and the Jewish nation is a single nation. And granted, when you compare to the rest of the world, I mean, there are more people groups in the world than there are Jews. So I just wonder, out of curiosity, do you think maybe why there's such a heavy emphasis in the New Testament of Paul, because there are more people to minister to in the world that are non-Jewish than they are Jews? Just a thought.
You know, I don't think that's an interesting thought. I would say that's very interesting, something to think about. I don't know if there's a way to answer that, really. You know, why God chose Paul to be the primary spokesman for the church, especially when he had the 12 apostles. And clearly the apostolic significance, I talk about it kind of Peter fading and Paul kind of elevating, but what do we have at the end of the Bible? We have the names of the apostles as the foundation stone of the heavenly city. I mean, these are significant guys. You know, and so even though we can talk about historically the fading and the increasing and so on, the apostles are pretty significant, even having a heavenly significance. And so God chose Paul to do what he did. God does not really tell us the why behind it, but it is an interesting point that you bring up, that clearly Paul's significance can't be ignored. Not when so much of the New Testament is built on his instruction. One of the things, I think I brought this up a few messages ago, these lists of the most significant people in human history. Paul is right on the heels of Jesus, in the world's view at least, when it comes to defining Christianity, because it's hard to escape the Pauline imprint on New Testament teaching. It's just hard to ignore it. It's clearly there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Christmas series, you talked about how Herod summoned the Jews and the Pharisees and the scribes, and he said, you know, if these divided people can agree on something, then it's got to be right.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is, you know, he was at, you know, when the Magi were
Yes.
coming, he was trying to locate. You know, these guys were well read,
Yes.
and studied the Old Testament scriptures. They were able to pinpoint and said, it's going to be Bethlehem.
Yeah,
right?
without a question. And then they brought in another text to interpret, to verify the interpretation.
To prove it. Now, when you fast forward to the folks like Anna and Simeon and the folks who are outside in the temple waiting for the Messiah, mm-hmm. you can clearly see that they're, by the ministry of the Holy Spirit, they're saying, you know, Naphtali and Zebulun, you know, this is where it's going to be, mm-hmm. and the light, and the Gentiles, he's the light of the Gentiles. They're clearly seeing the Gentiles as the being saved and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. It's stunning to me that these Pharisees, who are so well read, and the people who are in the teachers in the temple, who are teaching Simeon and Anna and all these other people who are waiting in the temple, they're not able to see that Gentiles are in the kingdom, when all over Isaiah, all over the Old Testament, it's very, very, I mean, from Genesis to Isaiah to Zephaniah, as you point out, it's like clear.
Yes.
So what's the, like, what
What's
is
the catch?
It's like, what is the catch?
Yeah. So what we have going on here is, so Jews, okay, so it's not the Jews didn't believe that Gentiles would be in. What they believed is that Gentiles would be in subservient to them. So they would have recognized Gentile conversion in the Old Testament. But even the text that I read today, what do we see in these texts? We saw Gentiles taking hold of Jews. And so in a sense, you could say that the Gentiles were subservient to the Jews. What was not clear was the co-equality of Jews and Gentiles in the kingdom. And that was the ultimate stickler. Now, some would have had even more problems than that, but that's the essence of what's going on here. Gentiles, and you see this in Acts 15, because in Acts 15, no one is debating Gentile conversion. What they're saying is, circumcise them first. We got no problem with them. Circumcise them first. You know, make them become Jews first, then let them in. And so what you have is a misunderstanding of the fact that God was going to bring in Gentiles as Gentiles and give them co-inheritance in the kingdom of God without circumcision, without adopting Moses. And Acts 15 is a great text to kind of read through to get a sense of where the Jews were. And so even the converted, I think even the converted Pharisees were saying, "Hey, circumcise these people," you know. And they spend all day debating that. They finally come to the truth, but it was hard won. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. All right. No other questions? Let's transition to our Bible study then for this evening.